The Stono Rebellion, Gabriel's Rebellion, the German Coast Uprising, Denmark Vesey's Plot, Nat Turner. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. We'll also discuss in some detail the various devices that have been deployed throughout time. I'm your host, Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Today we'll tackle a very painful and controversial subject, that being American slave insurrections and their inevitable conclusions by the way of the rope, sometimes by other methods, but usually the noose. We'll discuss in some detail the most notable of these that took place from the colonial period through the early decades of the new republic. Our starting point is the Stono Rebellion, also known as Cato's Rebellion. And then we'll cover four more, and each of these took place in roughly decade-long intervals beginning in 1800. And these other four are Gabriel's Rebellion, the German Coast Uprising, Denmark Vesey's Plot, and then finally the most remembered and eulogized of these, Nat Turner's Rebellion. Now, of course, there were many other smaller and lesser-known slave uprisings that happened on both land and sea, but for the sake and scope of this show, we'll direct our attention to the five that we've already mentioned. Let's get the magnifying glass out and dive deeper into these spectacles and their rather predictable aftermaths. The Stono Rebellion, aka Cato's Conspiracy or Cato's Rebellion. Of the revolts we'll be learning more about, the Stono Rebellion is the only one to take place prior to American independence. Also, it's notable for being the deadliest slave insurrection to take place in the history of the American colonies, not the states, but the colonies. It happened near the Ashley and Stono rivers in coastal South Carolina, and it dragged on for a week or so, commencing on September 9th of 1739. Now, this is an area about 20 miles from Charleston. The instigator was an African-born slave named Jemmy, Jemmy, by his owners, who were the Cato, or sometimes referred to as the Cater family. Though, as was the case with almost all enslaved people during this period, there's very little known about his specific origins or any other conclusive details about his biography. We can, though, make a few assumptions about this man's background, and these are based on some contemporary written evidence of the day, as well as considerable scholarship that's been carried out in the centuries following the revolt itself. It's known that Jemmy and his co-plotters were probably from Congo in Central Africa, or perhaps from modern-day Angola, which is West Central Africa, as he was referred to as Angolan in written accounts of the day. It might be worth mentioning that prior to total European colonization of the African continent, these terms were loosely used. And if you think of present-day Angola prison, the notorious Angola prison in Louisiana, Angola might have been a very general term, but I think we get the point of where this guy is coming from. So his origin, I guess, can be inferred for two reasons. Jemmy and his crew were known to speak Portuguese, and they were known to practice Catholicism. And the Portuguese had colonized these large swaths of the African continent and conversely spread their language and religion to these places. He was also known to be literate, as attested to by his slave masters, as well as some of the combatants he was soon to square off with. Literacy would have been highly unusual in any slave population, particularly one that seems to be mostly, if not all, foreign-born. In total, he seems to have initially recruited around 20 of his enslaved brethren to insurrection. Now, unlike the rage and revenge that motivated the other slave uprisings we'll be discussing, the Stono Rebellion was probably instigated by somewhat of a different motive. There never would have been any shortage of rage and revenge here, but this was the urge to escape the shackles of southern colonial slavery in the colonies by absconding about 150 miles south into Spanish Florida. It was there that the royal governors had promised full emancipation to escaped slaves from British North America for one, serving some military service, and two, converting to Catholicism. Well, that doesn't seem to be a big hurdle to clear for these guys. Now, I don't mean to imply that these people were peaceniks any more than those that held them in bondage, but it seems that they just really wanted to get down to Florida and free themselves from their shackles. And who wouldn't want to do that? So things get rolling on Sunday, September 9th of 1739. And whether it's true or not, this date has been suggested that it may not be an arbitrary one, as the date was the Sabbath, and most of the planters and the rest of the white population would have been at church at the time. Also, the colony of South Carolina had just passed a law called the Security Act of 1739, making it compulsory that all white male citizens be armed at all times in public, even in church. Compulsory? But this would not go into effect for a few more weeks, so that may be another reason as why the date was chosen. And maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but who knows? So reportedly carrying a banner that read, quote, "Liberty," in big bold letters, Jimmy and the heavily armed gang began their long, sweaty march down to Florida, and they wreaked havoc all along the way. Not sure how they initially garnered weapons at the start, but it won't take them long to add to their arsenal. Their first stop seems to be Hutchinson's store, and at that place they murder two shopkeepers and steal a cache of weapons and other supplies. Now, why these two poor souls weren't in church? I don't know. I'll bet they wish they were. But the rampage is on, and a capture and killing spree quickly ensues. In rapid succession, this mob burns down as many as 10 plantations and executes several of their white occupants. The estimate is the total killed is somewhere between 20 and 30 people. And this included not only plantation owners, but members of their families and even probably slaves that were loyal to them. This marauding mob also recruits other slaves as they progress through the landscape and forcibly conscript many more. At their height, they possessed a fighting force of probably around 80 people. It might have been a little bit higher. As word got out regarding these atrocities, the South Carolina Lieutenant Governor, William Bull, he encountered this band while on horseback, and he dashes off to alert the local free populace, and a posse of sorts is quickly formed. These two sort of ragtag combatants of seemingly equal size square off the next day near the Edisto River. As that day came to a close, roughly half of the slave brigands were mowed down and the rest escaped into the wilderness. Local Native American trackers, along with loyal slaves, were enlisted to track down the remaining absconders, and they gradually caught up with them. A final shootout happens within a few days, and all the rebels were either shot in the melee or captured and then executed. And as we'll see shortly, those that had been executed were decapitated and their heads placed on pikes on the crude roads that would have led in and out of the region. So just as in medieval times, this was a practice devised as a stark warning to others that would contemplate any further insurrection. Now let's get into Gabriel's Rebellion, which took place, or more accurately was meant to take place, around Richmond, Virginia, August 30th, 1800. Spoiler alert here, as we'll learn very shortly, the term Gabriel's Rebellion is really kind of a misnomer. It's more of a foiled plot than a rebellion. So who was Gabriel? He was born a slave in 1776 in the outskirts of Richmond. He's sometimes referred to as Gabriel Prosser, Prosser being the surname of his master or owner. It's cringeworthy to say those words, but that's what it was. And Prosser owned a plantation called Brookfield. In addition to Gabriel on this property, there were about 50 other slaves that were kept there. And it's worth noting that he, like Jimmy, who we've just spoken about, was the very rare enslaved person that could read and write. But perhaps this is not totally out of whack, as he was noted throughout his short time on this earth as a very thoughtful and learned person. Gabriel, like his brothers Solomon and Martin, were skilled blacksmiths, and as such, he was sometimes allowed off plantation grounds to ply his trade and reportedly even kept a small piece of his earnings. That probably was unusual at the time, although not totally unheard of. He seemed to be talented and well-liked by both his fellow people and the white plantation owners, although he did try to steal a white man's pig, and he got into a fight with this guy, eventually bit off a part of his ear. So, I don't know, is Mike Tyson a nice guy? Though this incident would have been considered a capital crime in his day, Gabriel was only banged up for only a month or so, but he did have his thumb branded. Well, maybe it's just a detail, but it's also probably a precursor to what follows next. His motivations, as might be expected, are difficult to fully decipher, but I think we can make some safe assumptions. In Virginia at this time, roughly 40% of the population was enslaved. And though that's stunning, it was far higher in South Carolina, for instance. But it's also important to point out that the numbers of black freed men and women, those who had had their slavery status manumitted, was growing quite rapidly. Gabriel was aware of this, and he probably sought to hasten this process, as John Brown would also try and fail to do at Harper's Ferry a few generations later. He is said to have secretly recruited a small army of would-be insurrectionists on many plantations and in several surrounding towns and counties in the early months of 1800 in preparation for a full-on slave revolt. Now, these men, like him, would have probably been amongst the upper echelon of the lower caste. No doubt many would have been fellow tradesmen and perhaps some of them also literate. This secret band of conspirators got down to work and began fashioning weapons in advance of their planned mutiny. Hundreds of swords and musket balls and spears were made, and the plan seems to have terrorized Richmond, and the idea seems to be to kidnap the Virginia governor of the day, James Monroe, the future 5th president of the United States. The idea seems to try to negotiate with him to gain their freedom. Now, it's easy to say in hindsight, but like most plots, it's just a bad and impractical idea. Like John Brown, like John Wilkes Booth, like Guy Fawkes, and untold others, it just seems doomed from the start. And it ends, as it usually does, with lethal consequences. Well, you can write the script. Gabriel and his bandits are outed by fellow slaves who alert their owner, named Mosby Shepard. Shepard happens to be a friend of Monroe, and the militia is soon called out and it's on high alert. About 70 conspirators are soon apprehended, but Gabriel escapes to Norfolk. But this does not last long, as he's ratted out by another slave named Billy King. So despite the plot never actually coming to fruition, justice was swift and it was deadly. Gabriel and his 2 brothers and 20 more were hanged at Richmond the same year. 1 committed suicide rather than face the gallows. 8 were, quote, sold outside of the state, banished never to return. 13 that were found guilty were inexplicably pardoned by Governor Monroe, whom they, after all, had planned to kidnap. A surprising 25 were acquitted, and 2 were actually granted freedom after informing their slavers of the plot. There ends the slave revolt that never happened. So let's take a break, and when we return, we'll move on to one that did happen, and that's the so-called German Coast Uprising. And that took place in what is now modern-day Louisiana, just about a decade later. The German Coast Uprising, though not nearly as well remembered as Nat Turner's rebellion or Denmark Vesey's plot, both of which will follow next, the German Coast Uprising actually involved arguably more people and more deaths than any other slave insurrection in American history. Unlike the others we're discussing, this seems to have been a mostly spontaneous and anarchic revolt with no obvious leader, though there were a few prominent players, one especially, who died by execution in a particularly brutal manner. This bloody event happened over a couple of days in January of 1811 along the east coast of the Mississippi River, not far from New Orleans, St. Charles Parish, St. John the Baptist Parish, and Jefferson Parish, to be exact. On January 8th of said year, somewhere around 100 slaves joined forces from a few neighboring plantations and set out to seek revenge on those that had enslaved them. They gained fellow travelers along the way as they set fire to at least 5 plantation houses this time, and their numbers grew to at least twice the original count and likely many more than that. And the first lethal violence took place at the Andre plantation, where the proprietor, Manuel Andre, was badly injured and his son Gilbert was murdered. The marauders then moved on to the neighboring plantations, including that of James Brown, a future senator and actually a foreign minister to France. He was later a famous R&B singer. Well, that's not true, but it sounds good. And it was there that one of his African-born slaves, Kook, K-O-O-K as it's recorded, joined the mob. And at the next stop, he himself murdered the second and last of the white folk, Francois Trepanier, with an axe. Well, as expected, things moved quickly now and not in favor of the insurrectionists. The wounded Andre, witnessing the death of his son, and he quickly sends word to the governor, and he assembles a militia composed of local men as well as 30 army soldiers stationed there and another 40 seamen that were docked nearby in New Orleans. As word leaks out, the militia continues to grow, and so it's basically over for this would-be uprising. The hunt was on, and things came to a head on January 10th and 11th, where Andre and another planter, Charles Perret, encountered the insurrectionists that had fled into the bayou from another plantation owned by a man called Jacques Fortier. This militia was assisted by Native American trackers. We'll learn a little bit more about them later, who helped find them, and during that day, somewhere between 50 to 70 of the marauders were hunted down and shot dead. We'll never know the real number. Now, who led this insurrection? Did anybody lead it? Was it spontaneous, as we've suggested? Or was it spearheaded by a certain person? Yes, there is a person, and his name was Charles Delande. He's described as a Creole of mixed racial extraction, and I'll leave it up to you guys as to whether the murders he directed were justified. Is a murder ever justified? We don't know much about his biography, and the history is scant, and it's in dispute. There's a debate among historians as to whether he was born on a plantation in Louisiana or born in Haiti and then sold into slavery. For what it's worth, research suggests to me that he was probably a native-born Louisianan, and he was probably inspired by Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, which immediately preceded these events. What we do know about him is that he was a slave driver, and I'll say it again, a slave driver. And as such, he was charged with being a sort of an arbiter. So he would have meted out discipline and brutality to his fellow brothers and sisters that were enslaved. It seems peculiar that a man who played this dual and despised role would end up leading this insurrection. But in the end, regardless of who he exactly was or where he came from, what happens next is straight out of a Tarantino movie. Once apprehended, he received no trial. Well, that's not really a surprise, I guess. But what he did receive was a sort of medieval execution. It was described by an onlooker as follows, quote, "First his hands were chopped off, and then as he writhed in horror, quote, he was shot in one thigh and then the other until both were broken. He was then, quote, shot in the body. And before he had expired, he was, quote again, placed into a bundle of straw and roasted." So that's sending the message to the would-be insurrectionists. So in other words, he was tortured and burned alive. The remaining fugitives were eventually captured and led to tribunals overseen in the parishes where this took place. 18 were killed by firing squad, and some others were hanged in the city center in New Orleans. All told, roughly 100 or so souls were decapitated, and their rotting heads were displayed on posts in and around New Orleans as to get the word out about any further violence of the sort. And this grim scene has been recreated in sculpture, and it can be viewed today, or any other day, at the Whitney Plantation in southeastern Louisiana. It's quite moving. And if you ever find yourself down there, you should check that out. Now it's Denmark Vesey's plot, and we'll next do our best to tell the tragic story of another would-be slave insurrectionist, that being a man who has gone down in history as Denmark Vesey, and his dates were 1767 to 1822. And these events took place again in South Carolina, and this happened in 1822, roughly a decade following the slave insurrection that we've just covered in Louisiana. Now, before we tell the story about what happened, let's try to sort out his actual name and background. It's likely that he was born in what we now call the U.S. Virgin Islands, but at the time of his birth, this would have been the Danish West Indies, thus his given name Denmark. He was purchased as a slave by a ship captain named James Vesey and taken first to Bermuda, which is where Vesey was based, and then he was transported to Charleston, South Carolina, where he was enslaved there. Now, something very strange happens here, unprecedented as far as I'm aware. He somehow manages to win a lottery, and with his winnings, he purchases his own freedom. This is a stunning story, and I don't know that it ever happened to anyone before or since, but he purchases his own freedom with a lottery ticket of some sort, but sadly, he was unable to do the same for his wife and children. While still in Charleston, he becomes a so-called freedman, and he works in various manual trades, and he seems to be quite successful. He was a deeply religious man, and he became very prominent in his community. In fact, he was one of the founders of the AME Church that today is known as Mother Emanuel. And if that name rings a bell, it's probably because you're familiar with the horrific murders that took place there in 2015 at the hand of Dylan Roof. I guess it's time to talk about the plot that never really was. No shots were ever fired, but it's generally agreed that even amongst his defenders, both then and now, that Vesey had been mulling a massive slave revolt for years, with the intention of murdering the plantation owners in the area and then fleeing to Haiti to begin free lives there. Let's keep in mind that South Carolina was a majority black population at the time, and a massive majority of those folks were enslaved. So it's probably not a stretch to assume that the appetite for revolt was considerable. Vesey would have divulged his plans to congregants of the church that he founded, and lots of speculation throughout the years is that he justified his intentions based on the book of Exodus in the Bible. As the word of the insurrection gets around in this polyglot society of Charleston, of both free and enslaved, few that were loyal to their masters, they inform local white officials of a coming doom that's about to befall them. So now it's time again to strike up the militias. And in June of 1822, the white population is on high alert, and over a fortnight or so, dozens of the plotters were arrested and jailed, including Vesey himself. In all, 131 were taken into custody. A magistrate court was formed, and secret trials then proceeded. Now, whether guilty or not, it's difficult to imagine that any of the accused were granted a fair hearing. Well, this makeshift court, interestingly, divided the accused into separate categories. Those that were said to exhibit, quote, energy and activity for the plot, who were to be hanged if found guilty, and then those who were minor actors, and they were to be deported. On July 2nd of 1822, Denmark Vesey and 5 other slaves were hanged in public in Charleston. And over the coming days and weeks, another 30 or so would die by the same method. About the same number were deported, probably to Cuba, where they were likely enslaved again. And the remainder were either acquitted or released. Curiously, there were also 4 white men convicted of various involvement in this plot, but they were sentenced to short jail terms or fines. Neither of these guys were known to be abolitionists, and they were probably motivated by the hopes of financial gain by those freedmen who planned to escape and required their services in helping them to do so. Shall we take another pause here? Let's do that. And when we return, we'll discuss what history generally considers to be the most notorious of the American slave revolts, and that's Nat Turner's Rebellion, which took place in Virginia in 1831. Nat Turner. It's not an overstatement, I don't think, to say that Nat Turner is one of the most consequential figures in American history. His deeds were quite obvious, and he played a pivotal role in the future of the United States. But his motivations for these deeds are quixotic. He was a very mysterious person, and so before we get into the details of the rebellion, let's take a closer look at Turner the man. He was born into slavery the same year of the Vesey Plot, that being 1800. His place of birth was at the Turner Plantation in rural Southampton County, Virginia. He had numerous traits in common with the insurrectionists that have preceded him. He was literate, he was intelligent, and he was deeply religious. In fact, he was not only religious, he was a religious fanatic. He was a self-proclaimed prophet who reportedly saw heavenly visions, and he was always making extreme proclamations and revelations. He was known to speak in tongues. He was a lay preacher on his plantation, and many of his fellow slaves did consider him an actual prophet. So as the Lord continued to speak to him, he began to share with other slaves in the region that God had commanded him and them to purge the evils of slavery and do so with violence. So it's interesting to note that after witnessing a solar eclipse that he believed was the Almighty's signal to him, he summons his supporters and he prepares for war. And on August 31st, 1831, Turner unleashed his reign of terror, purportedly proclaiming, quote, "Kill all the white people." And with a motley crew estimated at around 70 or so, and these would have been composed of slaves and freedmen, he runs amok and he begins to kill neighboring white folk of all descriptions. Women and children were not spared. In all, this gang murdered between 55 to 70 people, making it the deadliest slave insurrection directed at the white population. All were said to be killed with blunt instruments, such as hatchets and shovels. As always, as we've seen, retribution was swift and severe. Most of his conspirators were caught within days, and they were either shot summarily and they were beheaded. And again, their heads for all to see were placed upon pikes along these country roads. Somehow, Turner managed to go on the lam for over a month before he was finally found out. And he was hiding in a crevice in a farm field. And this amazes me that he was able to avoid capture for so long, but that is the story. And after being captured, he was hauled off to jail, and after a perfunctory trial, he was found guilty of, quote, rebellion and insurrection. Following his sentence, and in the short days prior to his execution, he granted an interview to a man named Thomas Gray, who famously wrote The Confessions of Nat Turner, which is a notorious pamphlet or book, whatever you want to call it, and it's been very controversial. This pamphlet was then, as it is now, sensational as to its accuracy. It's been widely discussed and often dismissed for almost 200 years. It is known that on the eve of his execution, when asked about his crimes, he replied, quote, "Was Christ not crucified?" Nat Turner was hanged to death on November 11th, 1831, and then he was beheaded. His body was dissected and flayed, and pieces of it were sold to a bloodthirsty public. So in the end, was Nat Turner a martyr or a murderer? Was he both? His legacy will long remain up for debate.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.